The morning sun cast long shadows across the weapons maintenance bay at Naval Special Warfare Command. Sarah Chen moved with practiced efficiency between the rows of carefully arranged firearms, her worn military boots barely making a sound on the polished concrete floor. At 28, she had spent the last 6 years as a civilian contractor, maintaining and servicing the specialized weapons that kept America's elite forces operational. To most people walking by, she appeared to be just another technician doing routine maintenance work. Commander Jake Morrison paused in the doorway, watching the petite woman work. He had arrived early to check on his team's equipment before their upcoming deployment to Afghanistan. His SEAL Team 6 unit was scheduled to leave in 48 hours, and Morrison was notorious for his attention to detail. Every piece of gear had to be perfect. Every weapon had to function flawlessly, because in their line of work, Sarah was hunched over a Barrett M8 2A 150 caliber sniper rifle, completely absorbed in her work. The massive weapon, capable of stopping vehicles and penetrating light armor, looked almost comically large next to her small frame. She had the rifle partially disassembled, its components laid out in precise order on a clean white cloth. Her movements were deliberate and confident as she cleaned each part with the kind of care usually reserved for precious artifacts. Morrison had seen countless weapons techs over his 15-year career, but something about the way Sarah handled the Barrett caught his attention. Most contractors treated the big rifles with a mixture of respect and nervousness. The Barrett was not just powerful but also complex, requiring specialized knowledge to maintain properly. Yet Sarah worked with an ease that suggested intimate familiarity, as if she had done this thousands of times before.
"Morning, Chen," Morrison called out as he approached. Sarah looked up, her dark eyes meeting his briefly before returning to her work. She had always been professional but reserved, rarely engaging in the casual banter that filled the armory during busy periods. "Good morning, Commander," she replied without looking up. "Your team's weapons are almost ready. I'm just finishing the final inspection on this Barrett." Morrison nodded and moved closer to observe her work. The Barrett was his personal weapon, the one he had carried on dozens of missions across multiple theaters of operation. He knew every scratch and wear mark on its surface, had fired thousands of rounds through its barrel. Watching Sarah work on it felt oddly personal, like allowing a stranger to handle a family heirloom. "You seem to know your way around that rifle," Morrison observed, noting how she handled the complex bolt assembly without referring to any technical manuals. Sarah's hands paused for just a moment before continuing their work. "It's a well-designed system, not too difficult once you understand the mechanics." There was something in her tone that made Morrison pay closer attention. Most contractors would have launched into a detailed explanation of their qualifications or shared war stories from their military service. Sarah simply continued working, her focus absolute and unwavering. The Barrett M8 2A1 had been introduced in the 1980s and had since become legendary among long-range shooters. Weighing nearly 30 pounds and measuring over 4 feet in length, it fired the massive 50 caliber Browning machine gun cartridge. In the hands of a skilled marksman, it was effective out to ranges exceeding 2,000 meters. Morrison had seen what the weapon could do in combat, had used it to eliminate high-value targets from distances that seemed impossible to civilian minds. As Sarah reassembled the rifle, Morrison noticed something that made him frown. Her movements were not just competent but precise in a way that suggested muscle memory developed over years of practice. She inserted the bolt carrier assembly without looking, her fingers finding the correct alignment by feel alone. When she cycled the action to test the mechanism, she did so with the smooth, practiced motion of someone who had performed the task countless times under pressure. "Where did you learn to work on these?" Morrison asked, his curiosity now fully engaged. "Army training," Sarah replied curtly. She began attaching the massive scope to the rifle's rail system, making minute adjustments with the kind of precision that spoke to deep understanding of the weapon's capabilities. Morrison knew that standard Army training did not typically include extensive work with Barrett rifles. The weapons were primarily used by special operations units and specialized sniper teams. For a contractor to have this level of familiarity suggested a background that went beyond basic military service. "What was your MOS?" Morrison pressed, using the military term for job specialty. Sarah's hands stilled for a moment. When she looked up at Morrison, he caught a flash of something in her eyes that looked almost like fear. Supply specialist, she said quickly, returning to her work on the scope mounting. The answer felt wrong to Morrison, though he could not immediately say why. Supply specialists handled logistics and equipment distribution, not weapons maintenance at this level. The way Sarah handled the Barrett suggested training and experience that went far beyond moving boxes and managing inventory. As Sarah finished her work on the rifle, Morrison found himself studying her more carefully. She was small, probably not more than 5 feet 4 inches tall, with the lean build of someone who maintained excellent physical condition. Her dark hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, and she wore the same coveralls as every other contractor in the facility. Nothing about her appearance suggested anything unusual, yet Morrison could not shake the feeling that there was more to Sarah Chen than met the eye. Range time? Sarah asked, looking up at Morrison. It was standard procedure to test fire weapons after major maintenance, ensuring they functioned correctly before returning them to service. Absolutely, Morrison replied. He wanted to see how the rifle performed, but he also found himself curious about how Sarah would handle herself on the range. Something about her demeanor suggested she would be more than just an observer during the testing process. The base shooting range was located a short walk from the armory, nestled between 2 hills that provided natural sound barriers. It featured targets at various distances, from 25 meters for pistol work up to 1,000 meters for long-range rifle testing. The Barrett range extended even further, with steel targets placed at distances that pushed the weapon to its limits. Sarah carried the rifle case with ease, despite the fact that the weapon and its accessories weighed nearly 40 pounds. Morrison walked beside her, his mind racing with questions he could not quite formulate. There was something about the way Sarah moved, a confidence and awareness that reminded him of his own team members. It was subtle but unmistakable to someone trained to notice such things. At the range, Sarah set up the rifle with the same efficiency she had shown in the armory. She adjusted the bipod legs to account for the shooting position and checked the scope settings with practiced ease. Morrison found himself watching her every movement, looking for clues that might explain his growing sense that Sarah was not what she appeared to be. "Want to take the first shot?" Sarah asked, gesturing toward the rifle. "Make sure everything feels right to you." Morrison nodded and positioned himself behind the Barrett. The weapon felt familiar in his hands, its weight and balance exactly as he remembered. He settled into his shooting position, adjusting his body alignment and breathing pattern. Through the powerful scope, he could see steel targets at various distances, their surfaces gleaming in the morning sunlight. He selected a target at 600 meters, a reasonable distance for an initial test shot. The crosshairs settled on the center of the steel plate as Morrison controlled his breathing and applied steady pressure to the trigger. The Barrett roared, its massive muzzle brake redirecting the blast and reducing felt recoil. Downrange, the steel target rang with the distinctive sound of a solid hit. "Dead center," Sarah observed, looking through a spotting scope. "Rifles tracking perfectly." Morrison fired several more rounds, testing the weapon at different ranges and confirming its accuracy. The Barrett performed flawlessly, each shot landing exactly where he aimed. He was pleased with the rifle's condition, but found himself increasingly intrigued by Sarah's running commentary. Her observations about wind conditions, bullet trajectory, and scope adjustments were far more sophisticated than he would expect from a supply specialist. "Your turn," Morrison said, sliding back from the rifle. "Make sure the adjustments hold true." Sarah hesitated for a moment, and Morrison caught another flash of that strange expression he had seen earlier. It looked almost like panic, quickly suppressed but unmistakable to his trained eye. "I'm not really qualified to shoot the Barrett," Sarah said quickly. "I just maintain them." The statement rang false to Morrison's ears. Everything about Sarah's behavior suggested extensive familiarity with the weapon, yet she was claiming she did not shoot it. The contradiction bothered him, adding to his growing sense that Sarah was hiding something significant. "Come on," Morrison pressed gently. "Just one shot to make sure the scope mount is solid. I've seen you handle that rifle like you've been doing it for years." Sarah looked at the Barrett, then at Morrison, her internal conflict visible on her face. Finally, she seemed to reach some kind of decision. "Okay," she said quietly. "Just one shot." She moved behind the rifle with the same fluid motion Morrison had been observing all morning. Her positioning was textbook perfect, her body alignment exactly what he would expect from a trained sniper. She settled behind the scope and began making minute adjustments to the rifle's position.
her movements confident and precise. Morrison watched through binoculars as Sarah selected a target at 800 meters, significantly further than the distance he had been shooting. Through the spotting scope, he could see her crosshairs settle on the center of a steel plate that looked impossibly small at that range. The Barrett fired, its report echoing across the range. Morrison immediately swung his binoculars to the target, expecting to see a miss or perhaps a hit somewhere on the edge of the steel. What he saw instead made him lower the binoculars and stare at Sarah in amazement. The bullet had struck the exact center of the 800-meter target, leaving a bright impact mark that was visible even without magnification. It was not just a good shot, but a perfect shot, the kind of precision that required years of training and natural talent. "Lucky shot," Sarah said quickly, already moving to pack up the rifle. Her face was flushed, and she would not meet Morrison's eyes. Morrison knew better. He had seen enough shooters in his career to recognize skill when he witnessed it. Sarah's shot had not been lucky, but rather the result of expertise that she was clearly trying to hide. The question that burned in his mind was why someone with such obvious shooting ability would be working as a civilian contractor, maintaining weapons instead of using them. As they walked back to the armory, Morrison found himself studying Sarah with new eyes. Her reserved demeanor, her reluctance to discuss her background, her obvious skill with weapons, all of it pointed to a story that was far more complex than her official personnel file suggested. Back in the armory, Sarah quickly secured the Barrett and began cleaning up her work area. Morrison could see that she wanted to escape the conversation, to return to the anonymity that her job provided. But he was not ready to let the matter drop. "Sarah," he said as she prepared to leave for lunch. "That was impressive shooting out there." She paused at the doorway, her back still turned to him. "Thank you, Commander. Is there anything else you need for your deployment?" The question was clearly meant to redirect the conversation back to business, but Morrison was not deterred. His instincts were telling him that Sarah Chen represented a mystery worth solving, and his experience had taught him to trust those instincts. "Actually, there is something," Morrison said thoughtfully. "My team could use someone with your skills. We're always looking for qualified shooters." Sarah turned around and Morrison saw something in her expression that looked like genuine fear. "I'm not interested in field work, Commander. I'm happy where I am." "Why?" Morrison asked directly. "Someone who can shoot like that, who knows weapons the way you do. Why are you content to stay in the background?" For a moment, Sarah looked like she might answer honestly. Morrison could see her weighing her words, considering how much to reveal. Then her professional mask slipped back into place. "I served my time, Commander. Now I just want a quiet life." With that, she turned and walked away, leaving Morrison standing alone in the armory with more questions than answers. He stared at the Barrett, now secured in its case, and tried to piece together the puzzle that Sarah Chen represented. Something told him that her story was far from over, and that the quiet life she claimed to want was about to become much more complicated. As he prepared to leave the armory, Morrison made a mental note to look deeper into Sarah's background. His instincts were screaming that there was much more to her than anyone realized. And in his line of work, instincts like that were not ignored. Commander Morrison could not stop thinking about Sarah Chen's perfect shot as he sat in his office that afternoon. The image played over and over in his mind. The way she had positioned herself behind the Barrett, the confident adjustment of the scope, and most importantly, the impossible accuracy of her shot. 800 meters with a weapon she claimed to only maintain, hitting dead center on her first attempt. It was not beginner's luck. It was the result of extensive training and natural ability. Morrison pulled up Sarah's personnel file on his computer, scanning through the basic information he had access to. Sarah Elizabeth Chen, age 28, born in Sacramento, California. Parents immigrated from Taiwan in the 1980s. Enlisted in the Army at age 18, served 8 years before taking a medical discharge. Current security clearance level, secret. Previous assignment, supply specialist, Fort Campbell, Kentucky. The file was remarkably thin for someone who had served 8 years in the military. Morrison had seen personnel records for supply specialists before, and they typically contained detailed information about assignments, training courses, and performance evaluations. Sarah's file looked almost deliberately sparse, as if someone had removed information rather than simply failing to include it. Morrison picked up his phone and dialed a number he had memorized years ago. Master Sergeant Tom Rodriguez answered on the second ring, his gravelly voice instantly recognizable despite the poor connection. "Rodriguez here." "Tom, it's Jake Morrison. I need a favor." "Commander, how's life and the teams treating you?" Rodriguez had been Morrison's senior enlisted advisor during his time as a platoon leader, and they had maintained their friendship even after Morrison moved to special operations. "Can't complain. Listen, I need you to look into someone for me. Quietly." Morrison gave Rodriguez Sarah's full name and social security number. "She's working as a contractor here, but something doesn't add up about her background." "What kind of something?" Morrison described the shooting incident, emphasizing the level of skill Sarah had demonstrated. Rodriguez listened without interruption, his experience telling him when details mattered. "Supply specialist, you said? That's interesting. What's her discharge code?" Morrison scrolled through the file again. "Medical discharge, but it doesn't specify the reason, just says service-connected disability and leaves it at that." "I'll see what I can dig up," Rodriguez promised. "Might take a day or two depending on how deep this goes." "You think she's hiding something big?" "I think she's exactly the opposite of what she appears to be," Morrison replied. "And in our business, that usually means someone has a very good reason for staying hidden." After ending the call, Morrison found himself drawn back to the armory. He told himself he was checking on equipment for the upcoming deployment, but in truth he was hoping to observe Sarah again. His instincts told him that every interaction would reveal more pieces of the puzzle. Sarah was working on a different weapon when Morrison arrived, a precision rifle system used by Army snipers. Once again, her movements displayed the kind of familiarity that came from extensive training. She handled the complex rifle with the same confidence she had shown with the Barrett, making adjustments and modifications with practiced ease. "How's the PRS coming along?" Morrison asked, trying to keep his tone casual. Sarah looked up briefly before returning to her work. "Just replacing the trigger assembly. The previous unit was wearing out." Morrison nodded and pretended to examine other weapons while actually watching Sarah work. He noticed that she made several modifications to the rifle that went beyond simple maintenance adjustments to the stock, fine-tuning of the scope mounts, and careful attention to the trigger pull weight. These were the kinds of modifications that competitive shooters or specialized snipers would make, not routine maintenance tasks. "You seem to know a lot about precision shooting," Morrison observed. Sarah's hands paused for a fraction of a second before continuing their work. "You pick things up working around these weapons all day. Must have been some pretty advanced training at Fort Campbell." This time, Sarah's reaction was more pronounced. She set down her tools and looked directly at Morrison, her expression guarded. "Commander, is there something specific you need?" "I have several weapons to finish before your team deploys." Morrison recognized the deflection but decided to press further. "Actually, there is something. My team is facing some challenging shots on this deployment. Having someone with advanced shooting skills could be valuable." "I told you yesterday I'm not interested in field work." "Why not? With your abilities, you could save lives out there." Sarah stood up abruptly, her professional composure cracking slightly. "You don't know anything about my abilities, Commander, and you don't know anything about why I choose to stay where I am." "Then tell me," Morrison said simply. "Help me understand." For a moment, Sarah looked like she might open up. Morrison could see the conflict in her eyes, the battle between her desire to remain hidden and some deeper need to be understood. Then her walls went back up, more firmly than before. "There's nothing to understand. I'm a contractor who maintains weapons. That's all." She turned back to her work, but Morrison could see the tension in her shoulders. He had definitely struck a nerve, confirming his suspicion that Sarah was hiding something significant about her past. That evening, Morrison found himself thinking about the mystery of Sarah Chen as he reviewed mission plans for Afghanistan. His team would be operating in mountainous terrain, conducting reconnaissance and direct action missions that would likely require long-range shooting. The kind of missions where having someone with Sarah's evident skills could mean the difference between success and failure. His phone rang, interrupting his thoughts. Rodriguez's name appeared on the display. "That was fast," Morrison said as he answered. "Had some luck with my contacts,"
Rodriguez replied. But Jake, this is bigger than you thought. Sarah Chen wasn't just a supply specialist. Morrison felt his pulse quicken. What did you find? Her real MOS was 11B infantry, but that's not the interesting part. After basic training, she was selected for advanced marksmanship training. Spent 2 years at the Army Marksmanship Unit before being assigned to a specialized reconnaissance unit. Which unit? Rodriguez paused. This is where it gets complicated. The unit designation is classified, but from what I can piece together, she was attached to Special Operations Forces, the kind of unit that doesn't officially exist. Morrison felt pieces of the puzzle starting to fall into place. What about the medical discharge? That's where the trail goes cold. Her medical records are sealed, but I found one reference in a casualty report from Afghanistan. She was listed as wounded in action during a classified operation in 2019. Wounded how? No details. But Jake, I found something else. Before her discharge, Sarah Chen held the Army record for longest confirmed sniper kill. The distance was classified, but my source says it was over 3,000 meters. Morrison felt his breath catch. 3,000 meters, nearly 2 miles. It was the kind of shot that entered military legend, the kind of achievement that marked someone as one of the most skilled shooters in the world. And Sarah had been content to hide that ability while maintaining weapons for other people to use. There's more, Rodriguez continued. After her discharge, all records of her specialized training were classified or removed from standard personnel files. Someone went to a lot of trouble to erase Sarah Chen's real military career. Why would they do that? Could be witness protection, could be operational security, could be she asked them to. But Jake, if this woman is who I think she is, you're dealing with someone who is among the most elite shooters in the military. The question is why she's hiding from it. After ending the call, Morrison sat in his office long into the night, processing what he had learned. Sarah Chen was not just skilled with weapons, she was potentially one of the most accomplished snipers the Army had ever produced. Her record kill shot placed her in a category with only a handful of shooters in military history. The implications were staggering. Sarah had been hiding in plain sight, using her position as a contractor to stay connected to the military world while avoiding the spotlight that her abilities would normally attract. But why? What had happened in Afghanistan that made someone with her skills want to disappear? Morrison found himself thinking about his upcoming deployment with new perspective. His team would be operating in exactly the kind of environment where Sarah's skills could be invaluable. If Rodriguez was right about her background, she had experience in the very type of mission Morrison's team would be conducting. The next morning, Morrison arrived at the armory earlier than usual. Sarah was already there, as he had expected, working with the quiet dedication that had initially impressed him. Now, knowing what he knew about her background, every movement took on new significance. "Sarah," he called out as he approached. "Do you have a few minutes? I'd like to talk to you." She looked up warily. "About what?" "About Afghanistan. About why someone with your background is content to maintain weapons instead of using them." Sarah went very still. For several seconds, the only sound in the armory was the hum of the ventilation system. When she finally spoke, her voice was carefully controlled. "I don't know what you think you know, Commander, but I know you held the Army record for longest confirmed kill," Morrison interrupted gently. "I know you served with a classified Special Operations Unit, and I know you were wounded in action in 2019. Sarah's face went pale. She set down the rifle she had been working on and turned to face Morrison fully, her expression a mixture of fear and resignation. "Who told you that? Does it matter? The question is why you're here instead of training the next generation of snipers. Why you're hiding abilities that could save American lives." Sarah was quiet for a long moment, and Morrison could see her struggling with some internal decision. When she finally spoke, her voice carried a weight of pain that made Morrison regret pushing so hard. "Because the last time I used those abilities, Commander, people died who shouldn't have, and I can't risk that happening again." The admission hung in the air between them, heavy with implications that Morrison was only beginning to understand. He realized that uncovering Sarah's secret was only the beginning. The real story, the one that explained why one of the Army's most skilled shooters had chosen to hide in the shadows, was far more complex and painful than he had imagined. Sarah,
Morrison said softly. "What happened over there?" But Sarah had already turned away, her body language making it clear that the conversation was over. Whatever had driven her to abandon her career and hide her abilities was still too painful to discuss even years later. Morrison found himself facing a dilemma. He had uncovered Sarah's secret, but in doing so, he had opened wounds that were clearly still raw. His upcoming deployment suddenly seemed less important than understanding what had happened to one of America's most elite warriors. Something had broken Sarah Chen's spirit, and Morrison was beginning to suspect that the real story was darker than anything he had imagined. 3 days passed before Sarah spoke to Morrison again. He found her in the armory after hours, sitting alone in the dim emergency lighting with a disassembled rifle spread before her. She wasn't working on it, just staring at the components as if they held answers to questions she couldn't voice. "Sarah," Morrison said quietly, not wanting to startle her, "you're here late." She looked up at him with eyes that seemed older than her 28 years. "I've been thinking about what you said, about saving American lives." Morrison pulled up a chair and sat down across from her. "And? Maybe you deserve to know why I can't do that anymore." Her voice was barely above a whisper. "Maybe someone should know what really happened." Morrison waited, sensing that pushing would only cause Sarah to retreat again. Whatever she was about to share had been eating at her for years, and he could see the weight of it in every line of her face. "It was March 2019, Sarah began, her fingers unconsciously arranging the rifle parts in precise patterns. "My unit was supporting a SEAL team on a high-value target mission in the Hindu Kush Mountains. Intelligence said there was a Taliban commander meeting with foreign fighters in a compound about 40 kilometers from our position." Morrison nodded, recognizing the type of mission. Joint operations between special forces and specialized reconnaissance units were common in Afghanistan, combining direct action capabilities with long-range surveillance and precision fire support. "The original plan was simple," Sarah continued. "The SEAL team would infiltrate the compound while my partner and I provided overwatch from a ridgeline about 2 clicks away. If they needed precision fire support, we were in position to provide it." Sarah's hands stilled on the rifle components. Morrison could see her slipping back into the memory, her expression becoming distant and haunted. The target building was a 2-story compound with thick walls and multiple rooms. Intelligence had identified the primary target, a Taliban commander named Khalil Rahman, but they weren't certain about the number of fighters inside or the presence of civilians. Morrison had been on similar missions. The uncertainty about civilian presence was always the most stressful aspect of urban operations, especially when precision fire was involved. The rules of engagement were clear, but the reality on the ground was often much more complicated. "Everything went wrong from the beginning," Sarah said, her voice growing tighter. "The SEAL team's insertion was compromised about 500 meters from the target. They came under heavy fire and had to fall back to a position where they couldn't effectively assault the compound." Morrison could picture the scenario. When direct action teams were pinned down, long-range precision fire became critical for breaking contact or eliminating threats that prevented mission completion. "The team leader requested fire support," Sarah continued. "Through our scopes, my partner and I could see multiple armed fighters moving between buildings, but the target structure still showed signs of possible civilian activity. Children's clothing hanging on a line, cooking fires that suggested families lived there." Morrison felt a chill as he began to understand where the story was heading. The moral complexity of counterterrorism operations often came down to split-second decisions made with incomplete information. Rahman was confirmed to be in the main building, along with several other high-value targets. The SEAL team was taking casualties and couldn't maintain their position much longer. They needed immediate fire support to break contact. Sarah picked up a rifle bolt and turned it over in her hands, studying it as if seeing it for the first time. "The mission commander gave me authorization to engage targets of opportunity. Multiple armed combatants were visible, and the tactical situation required immediate action." Morrison waited as Sarah gathered herself to continue. He could see the pain building in her expression, the weight of whatever decision she had been forced to make. "I had a clear shot at Rahman through a second-story window. Range was 3,547 meters, well within my capabilities, but at the extreme edge of reliable accuracy given the environmental conditions. High winds, temperature variations, and the angle of engagement all made it a challenging shot.
Morrison did the mental math. 3,547 meters was over 2 miles, a distance that pushed even the Barrett .50 caliber to its limits. For a shot at that range to be successful required not just skill but also perfect environmental assessment and a degree of luck that couldn't be controlled. "I took the shot," Sarah said simply. "The bullet flew true and Rahman was eliminated." But her voice broke slightly and Morrison could see tears forming in her eyes. Whatever came next was the heart of her trauma, the reason she had abandoned her career and hidden her abilities. "The bullet passed through Rahman and continued into the next room," Sarah whispered. "A room we didn't know was occupied by his family. His wife and 2 daughters were killed instantly by the same round that eliminated the target." Morrison felt his stomach drop. The nightmare scenario that every precision shooter feared, collateral damage that couldn't be undone, civilian deaths that resulted from a tactically sound but ultimately tragic decision. The intelligence was wrong. Sarah continued, her voice now barely audible. "Rahman was using his family as human shields, keeping them in the same building where he conducted terrorist operations. We had no way of knowing they were there, no way of seeing them through the walls." Morrison understood the impossible position Sarah had been placed in. In the heat of combat, with friendly forces taking casualties, she had made a decision that was tactically correct but morally devastating. It was the kind of scenario that destroyed even the most experienced operators. "The mission was a success," Sarah said with bitter irony. "Rahman and 3 other high-value targets were eliminated, the SEAL team successfully extracted with minimal casualties, and significant intelligence was recovered from the compound. Everyone called it a perfect operation." "Everyone except you," Morrison observed quietly. Sarah nodded, tears now flowing freely down her cheeks. "I couldn't stop seeing their faces. The wife was 26 years old, same age as I was at the time. Her daughters were 8 and 10. I killed 3 innocent people with 1 shot." Morrison reached across the table and gently took Sarah's hands, stopping her nervous manipulation of the rifle parts. "Sarah, you made the right tactical decision with the information you had available. Rahman's death saved American lives and prevented future terrorist attacks. Tell that to 3 graves in Afghanistan," Sarah replied bitterly. "Tell that to a father who lost his daughters because they happened to be in the wrong room at the wrong time." Morrison had seen good soldiers destroyed by similar situations. The moral weight of unintended consequences could crush even the strongest warriors, regardless of whether their actions were justified or necessary. "What happened after the mission?" "I finished my deployment," Sarah said, wiping tears from her face. "But I couldn't shoot anymore. Every time I looked through a scope, I saw those children. Every time someone praised my shooting skills, I thought about the family I destroyed with a single bullet." Morrison was beginning to understand the depth of Sarah's trauma. For someone whose entire identity had been built around precision and control, the knowledge that her greatest skill had caused unintended tragedy would be devastating. "The Army tried to help," Sarah continued. "Counseling, different assignments. Even offered to transfer me to training positions where I wouldn't have to engage targets. But nothing worked. I couldn't separate my abilities from what had happened. Every shot I fired, even at paper targets, brought back the memories." "So you requested a medical discharge?" Sarah nodded. "Post-traumatic stress disorder, specifically related to the moral injury of causing civilian casualties." The Army was understanding. They classified most of the mission details to protect operational security and helped me transition to civilian life. Morrison was struck by the tragedy of the situation. One of the Army's most skilled shooters had been lost not to enemy action but to the psychological aftermath of doing her job too well. Sarah's precision had eliminated a dangerous terrorist, but the unintended consequences had destroyed her ability to function as a soldier. "Why take a job maintaining weapons?" Morrison asked. "Why stay connected to this world if it's so painful?" Sarah was quiet for several minutes, gathering her thoughts. When she finally spoke, her voice carried a note of desperate honesty. "Because I'm terrified of completely losing who I was," she admitted. "Those skills, that precision, they were my identity for 10 years. I know they caused tragedy, but they also saved lives. I can't shoot anymore, but I can make sure other people's weapons function perfectly. Maybe that's how I atone for what happened." Morrison felt a deep respect for Sarah's struggle.
She was trapped between her guilt over the past and her need to contribute something meaningful to the world. Maintaining weapons allowed her to remain connected to her former identity while avoiding the direct responsibility of pulling triggers. Sarah, have you considered that your skills could prevent exactly the kind of tragedy you experienced? Training other shooters, helping them understand the moral weight of precision fire. You could save civilian lives by sharing your knowledge. Sarah shook her head immediately. I can't risk being responsible for another shot like that. What if I train someone who makes the same mistake I did? What if my instruction leads to more civilian casualties? Morrison could see the circular logic of Sarah's guilt. She blamed herself not just for the unintended deaths, but for any future consequences of her abilities. The trauma had convinced her that her skills were inherently dangerous, regardless of how they were applied. The SEAL team you supported that day, Morrison said carefully. Did they make it home safely? All of them, Sarah replied immediately. My shot allowed them to break contact and extract without additional casualties. 6 American soldiers lived because Rahman died. And Rahman's terrorist operations? What would have happened if he had survived? Sarah's expression showed she had considered this question many times. Intelligence estimates suggested he was planning attacks that could have killed dozens of civilians. His network was responsible for multiple bombings in Kabul. Morrison let the implications sink in. Sarah's shot had not only saved American lives, but had likely prevented numerous civilian casualties from future terrorist attacks. The moral calculus was complex, but the utilitarian argument was clear. Sarah, you saved more lives than you took. The tragedy is that you had to make that choice at all, not that you made the wrong choice. I know that intellectually, Sarah replied, but I can't feel it. Every time I try to rationalize what happened, I see those children's faces. I see the mother who died protecting them. No amount of logic makes that image go away. Morrison realized that Sarah's trauma went beyond the specific incident in Afghanistan. She was carrying the weight of every moral compromise that modern warfare demanded. The impossible burden of making life-and-death decisions with incomplete information and accepting the unintended consequences. The deployment I'm leaving for tomorrow, Morrison said carefully. It's the same type of mission you supported. High-value targets in urban environments with significant civilian populations. My team will face the same moral dilemmas you faced. Sarah looked up at him, understanding the implication. You want me to help prepare them. I want you to help them avoid making the mistakes that could cause the kind of tragedy you experienced. Your knowledge could prevent civilian casualties, not cause them. Sarah was quiet for a long time, wrestling with the possibility that her trauma could become a tool for preventing similar tragedies. Morrison could see her weighing the risk of re-engaging with her former world against the potential to protect innocent lives. I don't know if I can, Sarah finally whispered. I don't know if I'm strong enough to face that world again. Morrison stood up and placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. You don't have to decide tonight. But Sarah, running from your abilities hasn't made the pain go away. Maybe it's time to consider that embracing them in a new way could help you heal. As Morrison left the armory that night, he understood that Sarah's story was far from over. The most skilled shooter he had ever encountered was trapped in a prison of her own guilt, unable to move forward but equally unable to let go of her past. The question was whether she would find the courage to use her tragic experience as a foundation for preventing similar tragedies in the future. Morrison's deployment to Afghanistan was scheduled to begin in 12 hours, but he couldn't shake the feeling that leaving Sarah alone with her demons would be a critical mistake. He found her in the armory at dawn, methodically checking his team's weapons one final time. Her movements were precise as always, but he could see the tension in her shoulders, the weight of their previous night's conversation still heavy on her mind. Everything's perfect, Sarah said without looking up as Morrison approached. Your team's weapons are ready for deployment. Morrison nodded, but instead of taking the weapons, he pulled up a chair. Sarah, I've been thinking about what you said last night, about not being strong enough to face that world again. Sarah continued her work, but Morrison could see her listening. I've made my decision, Commander. I can't help you. What if I told you that my team is walking into exactly the same situation you faced in 2019? Sarah's hands stilled on the rifle she was inspecting. What do you mean? Morrison pulled out a classified briefing folder and set it on the table between them. This stays between us, but I want you to see what we're facing. Maybe then you'll understand why your knowledge could save lives. Sarah hesitated, then opened the folder. Inside were satellite photographs of a compound in eastern Afghanistan, intelligence reports, and tactical assessments. As she read, Morrison watched her expression change from reluctance to recognition to growing horror. "This is almost identical to the Rahan mission," Sarah whispered, studying the aerial photographs. "Same terrain, similar compound layout, high-value targets mixed with potential civilian presence. Our target is Rahman's successor," Morrison explained. Mohammed Yassin, who's continued Rahman's operations and expanded them. Intelligence suggests he's planning a major attack on coalition forces, but he's using the same tactics Rahman used, operating from populated areas with family members present. Sarah's hands trembled slightly as she continued reading the intelligence reports. Morrison could see her mind working, analyzing the tactical challenges and recognizing the moral dilemmas his team would face. "Commander, you can't make this decision in the field," Sarah said urgently. "Look at these photographs. Children's toys in the courtyard, women's clothing hanging to dry. This compound is definitely being used as a family residence." Morrison felt a spark of hope. Sarah was engaging with the tactical problem despite her reservations, her expertise overriding her fear. "That's exactly why I need your help. My team is skilled, but none of them have faced this specific scenario. You have." Sarah closed the folder and pushed it away, but Morrison could see that she was wrestling with the implications. "Commander, what if I advise you to take a shot and the same thing happens? What if my guidance leads to more civilian casualties? What if your guidance prevents them?" Morrison countered. "Sarah, you've learned from the most painful experience a precision shooter can have. That knowledge, that understanding of what can go wrong, could be exactly what keeps my team from repeating your tragedy." Sarah stood up and walked to the window, staring out at the morning sun. Morrison could see her internal struggle, the battle between her guilt over the past and her desire to prevent similar tragedies in the future. "Tell me about your team's sniper," Sarah said quietly. "Petty Officer Jake Stevens. Good shooter, steady under pressure, but he's never faced a situation like this. His longest combat engagement was 800 meters, and he's never had to make a shot with this level of moral complexity." Sarah turned back to Morrison, and he could see something changing in her expression. "How old is he?" 24. He's got a wife and a baby daughter back home." Morrison watched as Sarah processed this information. He could see her imagining a young father making the same impossible decision she had faced, carrying the same burden of unintended consequences for the rest of his life. "If he takes a shot like mine and innocent people die," Sarah said slowly, "it will destroy him, just like it destroyed me. Then help me make sure that doesn't happen." Sarah was quiet for several minutes, and Morrison could see her reaching some internal resolution. When she finally spoke, her voice was stronger than it had been since their conversation began. "If I do this, if I help you, I need guarantees that my involvement remains classified. I can't have my name associated with active operations again." Morrison felt a surge of relief. "Done. Whatever support you provide will be attributed to standard intelligence analysis. Your name stays out of all reports." Sarah nodded slowly, then moved back to the table and reopened the briefing folder. This time, she studied it with the focused intensity of a professional analyst, her trauma temporarily set aside in favor of her expertise. "The primary difference between this mission and Rahman's is the terrain," Sarah observed, pointing to topographical maps. "Your overwatch position will be at a higher elevation, which changes the angle of engagement significantly. Any shot into that compound will have a much steeper trajectory." Morrison leaned over to study the maps alongside Sarah. He could see her mind working through the complex calculations that precision shooting demanded, factoring in distance, elevation, wind patterns, and structural penetration. "The steep angle is actually an advantage," Sarah continued, gaining confidence as she spoke. "A shot from this position would impact the target at a downward angle, reducing the likelihood of over-penetration through multiple rooms. The bullet would likely impact the floor or foundation rather than continuing through interior walls." Morrison felt his respect for Sarah's expertise growing. Even traumatized and reluctant to engage, she was providing insights that could prevent civilian casualties. Her tragic experience had given her knowledge that no training manual could teach. "What about environmental factors?" Sarah pulled out additional maps showing seasonal wind patterns and elevation effects. March weather in that region creates challenging conditions, temperature inversions, unpredictable wind patterns, and the potential for sudden weather changes. Any shot will need to account for these variables. Morrison watched as Sarah's professional demeanor gradually overcame her personal reluctance. She was becoming absorbed in the tactical problem, her natural instincts for precision and control reasserting themselves. Commander, if your sniper faces this situation, he needs to understand that patience is more important than speed. The ramen mission went wrong because we were forced to make a quick decision under pressure. If your team can control the tempo of engagement, they can gather better intelligence about civilian presence. How do we do that? Sarah pulled out a notepad and began sketching tactical scenarios. Extended surveillance before engagement. Use of thermal imaging to identify heat signatures and movement patterns. Most importantly, confirmation of target isolation before taking any shot. Morrison realized that Sarah was not just providing tactical advice but was working through her own trauma by focusing on prevention. Her guilt over the past was being channeled into determination to prevent similar tragedies. There's something else, Sarah said, her voice becoming more serious. The psychological preparation for your sniper. Stevens needs to understand the moral weight of precision shooting in populated areas before he's in the field. Morrison nodded. What kind of preparation? He needs to visualize the worst-case scenario and prepare for it psychologically. What happens if he takes a shot and unintended casualties occur? How will he process that information? How will he continue to function as a soldier? Morrison could see that Sarah was speaking from painful personal experience. Her advice was born from the knowledge of what happened when shooters were not prepared for moral complexity. Sarah, would you be willing to brief Stevens directly? Share your experience with him? Sarah's face went pale at the suggestion. Commander, I don't know if I can do that. Talking to you about it was hard enough. Briefing another sniper about civilian casualties. Think about it this way, Morrison said gently. Stevens is going to face this situation whether you brief him or not. The question is whether he'll face it with the benefit of your hard-earned wisdom or whether he'll have to learn the same lessons you did. Sarah was quiet for a long time, and Morrison could see her wrestling with the implications. Finally, she nodded slowly. I'll do it. But only if you promise that if Stevens shows any sign of psychological stress related to moral injury, he'll be pulled from precision shooting duties immediately. You have my word. 2 hours before Morrison's team was scheduled to depart, Sarah found herself in a secure briefing room with Petty Officer Stevens. The young SEAL sat across from her, clearly wondering why a civilian contractor was providing operational briefing materials. Stevens, Sarah began, her voice steady despite her internal anxiety. Commander Morrison asked me to brief you on some specific challenges you may face during precision engagements in populated areas. Stevens nodded attentively. Yes, ma'am. The commander mentioned you have relevant experience. Sarah took a deep breath, knowing that what she was about to share would forever change how Stevens viewed his role as a precision shooter. I'm going to tell you about a mission that went perfectly according to tactical standards, but was a complete moral disaster. And I'm going to tell you how to avoid making the same mistakes I did. For the next hour, Sarah walked Stevens through every detail of the ramen mission. She explained the tactical decision-making process, the environmental factors that affected the shot, and most importantly, the unintended consequences that had haunted her ever since. Stevens listened with growing understanding, asking technical questions about shot placement, bullet trajectory, and structural penetration. But Sarah could see that he was also absorbing the moral implications, understanding that precision shooting in complex environments carried responsibilities that extended far beyond hitting the intended target. Ma'am, Stevens said when Sarah finished her briefing, how do you carry that kind of responsibility? How do you take a shot when you know there's a possibility of unintended casualties? Sarah looked at the young SEAL and saw herself 5 years earlier, confident, skilled, and completely unprepared for the moral complexity of modern warfare. You carry it by understanding that inaction can be just as deadly as action. Rahman was planning attacks that would have killed dozens of innocent people. My shot prevented those deaths, even though it caused others. But how do you live with the doubt? How do you know you made the right choice? You don't, Sarah replied honestly. You make the best decision you can with the information available, and then you carry the consequences for the rest of your life. The key is making sure those consequences are worth carrying. Stevens nodded gravely, and Sarah could see that he understood the weight of what she was telling him. Ma'am, if I face a similar situation, is there anything specific I should do differently? Sarah pulled out the tactical notes she had prepared. 3 things. First, take more time for target confirmation if at all possible. Second, use thermal imaging to identify heat signatures that might indicate civilian presence. Third, if you have any doubt about civilian safety, communicate with ground forces to see if alternative approaches are possible. And if I have to take the shot anyway. Sarah met his eyes directly. Then you take it, knowing that you did everything possible to minimize civilian risk. And if something goes wrong, you remember that the moral responsibility belongs to the terrorists who use civilians as shields, not to the soldiers trying to stop them. After Stevens left for final mission preparations, Sarah found herself alone with Morrison in the briefing room. The weight of sharing her story had been enormous, but she also felt something she hadn't experienced in years, a sense that her tragic experience might serve a purpose beyond her own suffering. "Thank you," Morrison said simply. "What you just did could save lives on both sides of this conflict." Sarah nodded, but she looked exhausted. "Commander, I need you to promise me something. If Stevens has to take a shot similar to mine, make sure he gets proper psychological support immediately afterward. Don't let him carry that burden alone like I did. I promise." "But Sarah, I think you should consider that you don't have to carry yours alone either. What you did today, using your experience to help Stevens prepare, that's healing work. That's turning tragedy into prevention." Sarah was quiet for a moment, then looked up at Morrison with something approaching hope in her eyes. "Do you really think it's possible to find meaning in what happened? I think you just started finding it." Morrison's team departed for Afghanistan that afternoon, carrying with them not only their weapons and equipment, but also the hard-earned wisdom of someone who had paid the ultimate price for precision. Sarah watched from the armory window as their transport disappeared into the sky, carrying her knowledge and her hopes for redemption to a battlefield half a world away. 3 weeks later, Morrison's voice crackled through a secure satellite phone connection. Sarah had been expecting his call since seeing news reports about successful counterterrorism operations in eastern Afghanistan. "Sarah, it's Jake. We're coming home. How did it go?" Morrison's voice carried a note of profound relief. "Stevens took the shot. Perfect placement, target eliminated, 0 civilian casualties. Your briefing made the difference. He took the time for thermal confirmation and waited for positive identification of target isolation before engaging." Sarah felt tears forming in her eyes, but for the first time in years, they were tears of relief rather than guilt. How is he handling it? He's processing it well, knows he made the right call, understands the moral complexity, and has the support he needs. Sarah, you saved that young man from carrying the burden you've been carrying. You turned your tragedy into his protection. After ending the call, Sarah sat alone in the armory surrounded by the weapons she had spent years maintaining. For the first time since Afghanistan, she felt like she might be able to move beyond simply maintaining other people's tools. Maybe Morrison was right. Maybe her traumatic experience could become the foundation for preventing similar tragedies. She picked up the Barrett rifle she had been working on and, for the first time in years, imagined herself behind its scope not as a killer, but as a protector. The path to redemption was not about forgetting the past or absolving herself of responsibility. It was about using her knowledge and experience to ensure that future generations of shooters would be better prepared for the moral complexities they would face. Sarah Chen, holder of the Army's longest confirmed sniper kill, was finally ready to stop hiding from her abilities and start using them to protect both the soldiers who wielded precision weapons and the innocent civilians who lived in their shadows. The Barrett in her hands was no longer a reminder of tragedy, but a tool for preventing it. The cleaning would have to wait. Sarah had a new mission, one that would honor both the lives she had taken and the lives she could still save. For the first time in 5 years, she was ready to be more than just a maintenance technician. She was ready to be a teacher, a mentor, and a guardian against the kind of moral injury that had nearly destroyed her. The war was far from over. But Sarah Chen had finally found her way back from the battlefield, not as the same person who had left, but as someone who could use her pain to protect others from experiencing it. In the end, that transformation might be the most important shot she would ever take.